Man, I just dig that new intro. That is so good. Welcome, everybody, to the Data and API show from Hasura. We are so happy to have you here today. I am joined by a special and will not be like unseen guest. We have Anjana today. Anjana, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Tell us who you are.
Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. So I'm Anjana. I am a new member of the Hasura community team, based in San Francisco, developer advocate on the team, and really excited to be here and be hanging out on the Data and API show all this month with Jesse. Pretty excited for this series. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a lot of fun. This super app, I personally refer to it regularly when I'm trying to put together demos or tutorials. I'm yanking code out of there for different things. It's got so much application to so many different things that we build just as front end engineers. And then especially when you're thinking about how do you build apps the Hasura way. And it's like, yeah, this pattern is kind of already roughly solved. And so there's a lot of really cool stuff that we're going to be having a look at here. Why don't you give us like a quick 30-second breakdown of like sort of your background, because you're going to be with us now for ever. I think that's in your contract, is you're not allowed to ever leave. So maybe you can give us a quick rundown of like just who you are, and just your background, and yeah, helps us kind of phrase or frame the context for the show.
Sure. Yeah. So I am coming in pretty new to Hasura and really excited that we have this series to kind of break down a lot of the different things that Hasura can do that I am still learning about. So I'm excited to learn along with folks at home about how all of these components come together. But a little bit about me. So I am a teacher turned developer. So I used to be an English teacher, through the field of linguistics, got into software development and found that I really enjoy thinking about the kind of high level, kind of sort of conceptual sides of how we're building apps. And so I'm really excited to talk about the different architectural approaches and the different kind of paradigm shifts that it might require for us to make, coming at it from the perspective of a basically full stack web developer. I spent more time on the front end the last couple of years, especially in the data visualization space. But before that, have worked on all kinds of different stuff across the stack. So kind of coming in with a pretty generalist mentality here. And I think a lot of us also have that kind of situation of we are tasked with putting together apps that do whatever is needed for the business application at hand, and often need to kind of like scramble to pull together different things from different parts of legacy systems, new systems that we need to pull together, different services we need to talk to. So I'm pretty excited because it sounds like the Hasura Super App is a pretty good example of how to kind of pull in all those very different chunks of functionality without needing to really be an expert in any of them. At least that's what I'm hoping, because I am definitely not an expert. So excited to learn along with everybody else, from you and from the community here, about how to do this and best practices with pulling together complex apps with Hasura.
Yeah, that sounds great. And this is actually a little bit of a homecoming for me with this project, because I was on the team that helped build it the first time. But like I was a month into Hasura at the time too, and so a lot of the code that I was writing was gently and graciously being replaced by other members in the team that would then inform me, well, actually in Hasura we don't have to do it this way. So I've got a lot of those like ingrained worst practices that I can kind of reference why we changed things and did things the way that we did them. And I'm hoping that now I also will have a bit more context to be able to shed light. So we're going to kind of have a bit of a spelunking on this together. I'm super excited to be able to have a look. And yeah, let's just dive right into it.
Awesome.
I'm
Yeah.
going to
And
go ahead
so
and
just
share. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just for folks, if you're like me and you haven't heard of the Super App before jumping into this series, you can check it out at hasura.io/reference minus app, which also has links out to the GitHub and all of the code there, but sort of gives a nice overview. So something to check out if you're watching at home or if you're checking out the recording later.
Yeah, great. All right, so let's get this screen on here, and we're gonna see the reference, the app that was built. Um, which was a whole bunch of scraped data. Little side story: the history of this project. Some developer advocates of the company have a thing for extremely cheesy names, and the code name for the project was Hasura. But that didn't clear PR. So anyway, it's now called the Hasura Super App, which I guess also works. But it's the standard e-commerce model, but it's a little bit more complicated. So it's multi-market, right? It's got a bunch of different merchants that are present here. So multi-merchant, multi-market. And you have your standard sort of filter abilities. You can kind of do whatever you want to do in terms of filter functionality. I think there was a button around somewhere for that, but just try and do a search on that. Looks like there is a bug in the code there, so we will fix that one later on.
Wouldn't be a demo without some of that.
Now we have baby things. So the front end is not the reference to be building off of. The reference to be building off is how we actually load data from the actual content. So let's have a look at the place where this sort of all begins for most of the journey, and that's going to be at the Hasura Super App website. And we have had content on this in the past. We've had reviews, we've had deep dives on like the overview of what's going on here. So this specific series, we're having a deeper look at kind of more of the architectural side, and we're going to spend basically all of our time to the right of this relationship here, where we have essentially this actions bridge, if you will, that connects us to the file storage. It connects us to the actual custom business logic handlers. It connects us to payment processing. Anything that essentially goes beyond the typical CRUD of your database to anything that has business logic. We generally fall back to the Hasura actions, which are these abilities to persist if you will, it's essentially a resolver, custom resolver that you point an endpoint at, and then you're able to say, okay, I want to process behavior in there and then send back a payload that I'm able to actually query across and be able to read that data. So that's kind of the base actions model that we work with. And we're going to spend most of our time sort of working on that, but we're going to have today's shows mostly on looking at the actual architecture of how this works. So to do that, we're going to click on the Get the Code. I actually already have that tab open, and we'll have a little breakdown look at the repository, which I do have cloned here locally. So let me go ahead and just pull that up, and we'll have a look at the actual code here. I'm going to go ahead and close down my consoles here. And we're going to boost the font size here just a little bit so we can kind of have a proper look down.
Yeah, great. So if folks have any trouble seeing, just let us know in the chat. Thanks a lot for keeping us on our toes there.
Are you able to pull that banner off real quick just so they can kind of see all of the sidebar? That'd be great. What we have essentially starting from the top, VS Code settings, which is not relevant. We have the metadata directory where the entire application. So if you're familiar with the Hasura model, now Anjana, have you actually had a chance yet to look at or play with Hasura metadata?
So I would love it if we can take a step back and talk about the Hasura metadata, because this is something that Jesse just filled me in on the other day, yesterday, what is time? But I was really excited to see that we can actually, if I'm understanding correctly, we can use the Hasura metadata to tell Hasura basically what are the different parts of the system that we want to be pulling together. Is that a high strokes, generally correct conception?
It's kind of our IAC approach, if you will. So Hasura allows you to define
being IAC.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry. It allows you to define. So in Hasura itself, it allows you to define relationships that are arbitrary in GraphQL land. So you don't have to necessarily have it be strictly identified by foreign keys or primary keys. It allows you to add additional metadata for comments on schemas. It allows you to attach remote schemas to tables or whatever else. So there's a lot of connections and things happening inside of the Hasura like data ecosystem. And if it sounds like I'm straining the word Hasura, it is, because I am retraining my brain to say it properly, because it is not Hasura, it is Hasura. So that's why I'm belaboring the pronunciation on that just a little bit. But anyways, so if we look inside here, we can kind of see what's happening. We have these top level configurations here. So the config essentially tells us what are we calling our admin secret? In this case, pro tip, don't actually do a production admin secret of my secret. Tells us which
director. We do, folks.
Yeah, exactly. Then we have the top level metadata directory. And then you have essentially some default behaviors for actions. So what is our base webhook handler? In this case, it's localhost 3000. And that's going to be our Next.js application, which exposes API routes as pages underneath the API directory as serverless functions. It is not specifically a Next.js thing. It is just how we can helpfully see where we map all those to. You can actually see it right here under pages. And then you go down to the API routes, and we're able to actually see that by convention, we nest a lot of our handlers underneath the /actions folder, just for the purpose of us to kind of know these are things that are happening or are being exposed to Hasura. And so we have things like login, sign up, and uploads and behaviors like that, which we'll be getting into as we go along.
Okay, cool. So if I may, just to take a pause here and sort of zoom out a little bit. So just to recap what I've understood so far, make sure that my conception is not getting too far off base. So what we have in Hasura is this like really cool, and this is one thing that I think is awesome about Hasura, is this really cool kind of layer that connects to all of these different places, right? So I've got my database Hasura is talking to. I possibly have remote schemas, which are essentially other external kind of GraphQL APIs that I can tell Hasura how to talk to. And then I have whatever other custom business logic that I've written in my own little handlers, which now this is what we're doing here in terms of this actions metadata that's pointing Hasura to all of these handlers that I've written myself so that it can kind of relay events that happen on the database or that happen on these other APIs or that happen in other actions into my handlers, which then do whatever I need to do with them. Is that broad strokes right? Have I gotten
that's really the high level. So actions are where I want to perform a behavior that is not going to be something that is something mappable to a typical like CRUD action, so create, read, update, or whatever. But and I could save these all as like a saved SQL procedure, for example, inside of Postgres, and then expose that procedure, a stored procedure, store that procedure, and expose that on the API. Be able to do a lot of database things. Generally speaking, in web land, it's easier to, let's say if I want to look up weather reports, I'm not even sure if it's possible. Some SQL person out there is kind of like, well, all I got to do is just like, but so if I wanted to like do an action that says, get me all the hotels that currently have sunny weather, well, I need to like do an action that goes back and it fetches all the hotels back from my database into my handler, and then does like a geo lookup and gets, filters it down by sunny, and then it like sends back just that subset of payloads, for example. So those are behaviors that's like my business logic. That's my core business is sunny hotel stays. But then you basically have like your ability to say, and the business case here is that I'm able to abstract my business logic and what my actual business is, surfacing sunny hotel stays, as opposed to writing all of the boilerplate that I would need to run a microservice for everything else to be able to stand up this entire stack. I can just write down this really specific bit of code that's relevant to my business and add that as a layer on top of my existing database, not as a whole other service that I have to sort of stand up and replicate content between multiple systems. That's kind of the business case. Yeah.
Okay, so what we're doing is we're basically letting Hasura kind of handle all of the stuff that it usually handles, of talking to the database, giving you that instant GraphQL API, perhaps talking to other endpoints through the remote schema connection, but also I'm able to kind of insert my own little bits of logic as I need them without having to kind of create the entire platform that would need to stand on to exist as its own service. Yeah. Okay, cool. And so in order to do that, I am gathering that I'm going to need to kind of think a little bit differently than how I would about if I was going to kind of stand up that service in the olden days before I had an awesome system like Hasura. So instead of thinking really more about like, okay, how am I going to manage all of this? How am I going to kind of keep track of like the state of the application? I'm going to have to start thinking a little bit more in terms of the events that are happening in my system that I want to then respond to in different ways. So sort of taking a more kind of event driven look at how folks are interacting with the app and how data is passing through different parts of the app. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So you're thinking about the actual architecture of your application, and you're thinking about the way that you want to sort of model the behaviors, model the flow of data, and you're not worrying so much about the actual structure of how to set up the base pieces. Because you get that instant API, we're mapping you the API to your database, and then you're able to layer on your custom business logic in these smaller pieces. And so, yeah.
Okay, cool. So maybe before we dig into that, there was a question in chat just about general Hasura capabilities. Can 2 or more individual Hasura instances talk to the same database in parallel?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and then as far as I know, but with Hasura, it's literally just reading and accessing your database. It's not installed on your database. There's nothing else that it's not locking your database. And so you're able to even work with tools. If you have some sort of other tooling in place that is pumping data into a Postgres database from who knows what IoT something or other, you can then layer Hasura directly on top of that, something else that's like actively working with this Postgres database, and Hasura is going to give you an API to that data. In fact, we have people doing that in like ETL workloads where they're using one tool that's just dumping a bunch of content into a Postgres database, and then they've got Hasura as a way to use API access to this content. So there's nothing specifically saying that you would have to only be able to use one Hasura instance to one Postgres database or 2 Postgres or whatever. So you can kind of mix and match the way that you'd want to do. Inside of Hasura, you would be able to also add multiple databases as well. So there's all kinds of ways to configure a solution you'd want. I would be curious to know more of the use case as to why you would have 2 Hasura instances on the same Postgres. That would seem more like a dev environment or a staging environment, which kind of gets us back towards the topic of so if you have one Hasura instance for auth and another for business data, does that work the way? So what I would say in that case, you would want to probably just create different roles and expose those behaviors as like, so if I go to my permissions and I say, okay, and let's just actually show where these pieces are. If I go inside of the Hasura interface here, and I've got, a bunch of these tables that, for example, let's say site admin is something that's only going to be admin related, and it's not something I want to expose to my front end developers. They should never have access to it. Then you would be able to go into something like your permissions on that and be able to lock down like who even has access to reading this data. And then that would never be exposed either to any of the actual to the endpoints that I'm exposing to my front end.
Gotcha. So, and then we also have our awesome teammate Praveen jumping in to hopefully clarify that each instance of Hasura reads the metadata in Postgres and serves the API. So multiple instances of Hasura can connect to the same database if you want to scale up. Thanks so much.
Yeah, Praveen. And to solve the use case, so I would probably recommend just saying make those be exposed via permissions as opposed to something that you'd want to necessarily have. And you can even do that like with actions too, for example. You could say for the admin login action, again, I can go into permissions and say which roles even have access to this. and be able to hide and say, don't give access to this or the other thing. So love,
Awesome.
yes, yes, yes.
Awesome. Yes, lots of love for Hasura happening. So this is basically like how I've been thinking about Hasura, is kind of as this sort of abstraction layer over all of these different data sources and I guess chunks of business logic functionality that we want to be talking to. Hasura sort of acts as this kind of glue between all of these pieces that then Hasura can manage like who gets to talk to what and in which situations which pieces of this complex architecture are awakened or triggered, as it were. Is that
API awakens?
About it?
If colleague Kushik is watching this, he will appreciate a Star Wars reference. Also, shout out to Kushik. He's the one that did the majority of the data and API rebrand. So awesome work there.
Love it.
Yeah. So Hasura is the metadata. Hasura is the way that we describe, connect, and architect data together. Because the win here is that we're shipping a single API to our developers. We're not having to worry about orchestrating a round trip to my auth service on the front end and then back, and I'm trying to work with payments providers on which timing are these transactions happening. I'm abstracting all of those pieces behind these actions, behind these different just behind. So on the server, I'm abstracting all this interaction and just surfacing this as a thin API access that I'm able to ship to my developer and say, yeah, the login method, in this case, a mutation for GraphQL, is right here. And if I need to expose that as a REST endpoint, I can restify one of those GraphQL mutations or queries, and I can expose that as well. But I'm not having to manage, manipulate, or ship multiple versions of the APIs to different clients. Everybody's getting the same thing, and I'm able to do all of my logic at this data orchestration layer that is Hasura. And that's where you'll see things like the metadata here. So under metadata, we can describe which databases we're dealing with. We can describe the actual individual actions that we're exposing, like mutations and queries and string inputs. We're going to go over some of this stuff more in depth. Overall, actions, behavior. So all of this kind of stuff takes place at the metadata layer, and that's what Hasura is doing. Is it's building out this metadata. In fact, this version that I'm running right now, you'll see you'll see the port here is 9695. I don't know if I have this. Oh, I do. Look at that. Does that actually zoom in for everybody? No, it does. Does it?
I see a zoom in.
Yeah, very good. Okay. We have that 9695 there. That is a proxied version of the Hasura interface, that anything that I do in this interface will actually write real-time metadata to that directory. And then I can check that directory into version control and be able to share with team members. I can branch it. I can be able to create different versions that now everybody else has access to. So this is a really powerful paradigm where I'm not touching my database except for when I'm actually using the API to manipulate the content. You bring whatever database we support to the party, and you'll get APIs, and you add a couple of services on top of it, and you've got a full-fledged, fully powered API sitting on top of your data plus your business logic, and you can just work with that.
Cool. Okay, and then
we'll work with it.
Because that metadata is sort of persisted as code in this, which I can check in, and version control, I can also kind of, as I'm architecting a really complex kind of site like this, which, as we'll see, the Super App has like so many different things going on, I can use that as a way to sort of stay on top of the changes that I'm making to my architecture and be able to kind of like more clearly conceptualize how my system is put together by looking at that metadata directory. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So
cool.
I would suggest let's try to trace one of these actions or let's finish the quick tour of the code so everybody kind of sees what's happening, and then we'll trace one of these actions all the way through from where we define it inside of Hasura, where that gets persisted in the metadata, so we can just kind of see the connected pieces, And then we'll be able to see where the actual handler is happening from the Next.js side. And that'll sort of show us a little bit of what's actually happening. I think it's probably a good way to sort of see that thread go through the different pieces of our code here, to help us kind of figure out a bit more, kind of solidifying what we're discussing here.
Yeah,
is that a good
sounds
plan, you
great.
think?
Sounds great. And maybe before we jump into that, so there's some discussion in chat around authentication methods. We've got the JWT or JOT tokens. Praveen is already helpfully clarifying that we can use webhook methods, or we actually recommend the JWT or JOTs. But I think next week, we're going to be really digging into authentication in a lot more detail. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the current plan. I think we will use potentially authentication as one of the examples tonight, just to look at how the pieces connect. And then we'll be able to sort of dig into that a bit more next time and be able to see exactly sort of how these pieces all fit. So
great. Okay, so we can come back to that discussion. So thanks so much, Aris and Praveen, for bringing that up. We'll come back to that as we go through the stack here.
Yep. Also, shout out to other open source sweetheart, Ori, which is kind of like a Auth0 Okta sort of rival, but open source product out there that we like to give open source projects a little bit of love on this show. All right, so we're going to go ahead and have a quick finishing the tour here. So this is where the metadata is stored. When I'm running this console locally, I'm basically just using the Hasura CLI. I go in there and I say, okay, launch Hasura console, which then says, give me a proxied version of the Hasura example that is running at the defined URL inside of my Docker Compose file. This is not going to be a Docker Compose crash course. Let's go ahead and just zoom this out. But we've got a couple of services here at a high level. I'm going to break these down just to kind of view them from a top level. Essentially what we have is we've got the Postgres service. So everybody should be relatively familiar with that at this point. We have the GraphQL engine, that is Hasura. That's what we refer to it as, is the GraphQL engine. Sometimes you'll see us in our documentation referred to HGE, that is the Hasura GraphQL engine. Then we have Next.js, which is our application for the front end, and our service handlers for the back end in one, which is partially why we use Next.js, because it helps us cut down on code. And then we have Minio, which is our object storage and open source alternative to S3, or uses the S3 protocol. It is a really great solution as well. Yeah, I told you, Ori is a great thing there. So ours is seeing the light over there. It's good. Also, shout out to German Tech, because I'm in Germany. I think they got teams all over now, but yeah. Anyways, so we have basically Minio, we have Next.js. This is our service stack for this project. Postgres, GraphQL engine are coming together. Next.js is the one that we've added in for our service handling. Minio for storing images. Specifically, that's where we store the actual images that we're loading for the products. That's where we're storing things, because blob data is not ideal for Postgres. So that's essentially why. All right, so let's go ahead and have a quick look through the stack here. So we have then seed data generator. This is a utility that just generates the actual seed data for like creating transactions and behaviors and activity. We're not going to touch that at all in this entire stream. This is just a way to be able to generate dummy data. The sketch is sort of actually just kind of the front end pieces. If you ever are curious and wanted to see kind of how it came together, we've left that in there because we just decided maybe it's helpful to kind of see how the front end. I believe it's actually a Svelte project, but just to see how the front end grew and then was developed totally in isolation, and then just mapped to these API endpoints inside of a React application at the end. So really nothing very, very crazy on the code here. This is like, you can do this.
So what I like about this, and what makes it is a lot to sort of take in all at once. But what I like about this is that essentially all of these different pieces are largely independent of each other, right? Like, for example, as you just said, when I'm building the front end, I don't really need to be I just need to know like what the data is that I'm getting back from the GraphQL API that Hasura exposes. And I don't need to, while I'm building that, also be worrying about bits of logic, business logic that are happening in different handlers, or how I'm talking to the database or things like that. And so I can handle each of those kind of concerns separately in their own little areas. And again, Hasura is the one that kind of like talks to all of them and sort of orchestrates it all into a single API I can talk to. Is that right?
Yeah. I want to touch back because there's been a couple of on the auth conversation. There's been some talk about JWT use cases. One feature we just released this last week is multiple JWTs inside of Hasura Cloud. It is a feature that requires cloud to be able to work. So it's not something that's available on the CE edition, the community edition, but it is something that will handle a lot of use cases where somebody would need different auth methods to be able to read from Hasura. So definitely have a look at that if it's something that you're wanting to try out for multiple different clients or different auth providers. If you're working on something like WebN or you're using something like a mobile client, you can enable multiple JWT resources that way.
Yeah, and so just to recap some of this discussion for posterity. So in terms of the different authentication methods, Praveen sort of helpfully breaks it down that, you can, we're going to be talking about kind of building your own, rolling your own auth, right? But probably in practice, you'd want to use an auth provider like Auth0, Okta, or Ori, is the other one? And that'll allow you to generate the JWT token that then you can integrate with your Hasura experience.
Yeah.
And you do have webhooks to fall back on if you need to, but the recommendation is to use these JWTs, these JWTs. So because webhooks will be a little bit more latency inducing. So we want to keep things snappy. Awesome.
I'm also going to use this opportunity just to drop one last reference here, because JWTs are special. This link here, I'm going to just drop it in chat here. This is a really great reference for working with JWTs in general, and it's actually, I think it's the Ultimate Guide, Hasura Ultimate JWT. And it's Ultimate Guide. Sorry, I gave you a second really good link. The one that I wanted to share primarily is this one right here. This link here is like the JWT deep dive you always wanted. So it explains how it all works. What are the best practices, including, using rotation keys, using plain text inside of like, in one place you want to do encrypted text, and in another place you want to do plain text, and you check them on the server. I mean, it goes into everything. So it has a lot of great resources in there. So definitely have a look at that.
Awesome.
And to loop it back to actions, like this is partially why we do this stuff, right? So you can abstract like a login behavior, which is how you get your JWT back to persist to your client. You can just have that action live forever. And if you need to update the backend to change which auth provider or which system you're using, you can swap out that behavior, and you're not having to rip out tons of front-end code or replace a whole bunch of front-end code to add a new auth provider. You can actually persist all this auth behavior in an action and be able to say, okay, I want to actually abstract a lot of these details and provide that layer of abstraction for future-proofing my tech stack, so that I can iterate slowly or incrementally new service providers or new functionalities that I don't have to actually be able to, or I can have both in place. I can say, login Ori, login Auth0 or whatever, and be able to actually persist this behavior as well. So that's one of the reasons why going with actions is so powerful, is because you don't actually have to swap out front-end libraries or be running multiple front-end libraries to try to work with these providers out of the box. So
Awesome. Yeah,
Looping
no,
it all back
that's
to
great.
actions. It all comes back to actions.
Love making things like nice and modular like that. Like we've got all these different Lego pieces kind of fitting together. And
Yeah.
when I get a cooler Lego set, I can swap out one of the pieces or all of them if I want without necessarily having to kind of rethink my entire app, my entire system. So that's pretty cool.
It all comes back to Legos at the end. Yeah. So we have here a couple of docs here. So with the Docker Compose file, we have how to contribute. We've got some basic README stuff, and then we have the www folder, which is again our Next.js application. And very specifically, where we'll be spending the majority of our time is looking at this API subdirectory, where we persist the actions in particular for what we're adding to our API. I will note and call out on the code itself, if you look at something like the architecture MD here, it is a relatively like it kind of runs you through like how this is all supposed to behave and work, that what the architecture is intended to be. So I would have a look at dig through some of this documentation. I'm not sure why that's not working. But you'll be able to see some of this content, sort of like how these services work together. So, for example, we have my account. We have the login action at Hasura, which calls this login route underneath the API routes from Next.js, and then that comes back to the client side to actually update the content that you have on the page. So we've got everything here sort of broken out to kind of explain what the behavior is and how these pieces play together. So if you want to have some further reading, we did try to give it pretty thorough documentation, but obviously looking at the code is the way to go.
And so all of this again is in that GitHub repo, Hasura e-commerce, so folks can peruse at their leisure.
Peruse.
And so in terms of this sort of action-based architecture, are there does the structure of this kind of emerge naturally from just knowing like what the different functionalities are that I need to accommodate, login, sign up, these different things that my particular site is going to be doing, like in this case payments or leaving reviews or what have you? Are there kind of like big questions that I'm going to have to ask myself? How do I want to set this up with actions? Or will it just kind of clearly emerge to me that, oh, this is something I want to happen. I need to create a new action to represent it. Like, are there kind of decisions I'm going to have to make about how to structure this in terms of actions?
Yes and no. So basically, it's going to come down to how good is your database skills. So if you are an SQL ninja and you know like how to make the databases spin, then by all means persist this data on the DB because it won't get faster than that, right? So put this into a stored procedure or a function on the database and do those kind of things. But if you can't do it with like a database, like an SQL command, then you'll put it inside of an action. It's kind of the
Okay.
low level way to have a look at it. So if it's anything to do with manipulating the database just by itself, that'll all take place through the Hasura interface. And in a lot of cases, actions will use the Hasura API to manipulate the database based on the conditions presented inside of the action itself. So did I find a user? Yes, put inside a temporary token or something or whatever. Like we'll be able to do those kind of behaviors. But if it's something you can't do with SQL, then it probably goes into an action. And it's specifically if you're calling it from the API. If it's a behavior that you want to have as a side effect, like an event occurring under a condition when something takes place on the database, then that's an event, and we have those, and they follow a very similar paradigm. But specifically, if you're calling a behavior, this is then something that you're gonna put inside of an action.
Okay, so then the distinction between events and actions is that actions are kind of custom defined behavior that's going to be triggered on certain events, or what's the interaction there?
let's see if we actually have any events. I'm actually not sure if we have any events defined. We don't. So what it would be is, let's say I had a case where underneath the data structure, so we've got things like addresses, orders, order products, join tables, and products, yada yada yada. If I were to create a new order, well, it could be that I want to actually trigger an additional system every time I have a new order that kicks off all kinds of behaviors, like notifying the staffing that we need to make sure we have like a fulfiller there for the next day, or who knows what your process might be. So if it's a behavior that should happen as a result of something else happening, that's an event. And then if it's something that I want to specifically like make happen, then it would be an action.
Okay.
And I would really harp on. I think it's harp on, right?
Yeah.
That's really nice having an English teacher in the call with me. So basically, I would really avoid doing two things with one action, right? So I would really recommend not having side effects take place inside of actions. They should be something that you can trace through your entire architecture and say, I created an order with 30 items through an action, some kind of special behavior for an order. So I made a special order action, and then that order creation triggers the next behavior. And that's not something that I should say trigger and create the order. That would give you a lot of like chaos and difficult to debug application architecture.
Okay, great. So sort of best practice is like one behavior, one action, break it down into kind of pipelines, like almost, I don't know if there are other folks who are big fans of functional programming in this stream from a company with a Lambda. But I like taking that kind of like functional sort of pipelining approach of like, we're going to break down all of the different things that need to happen into single operations, and we can string those together, compose that kind of chain of events or chain of behaviors, let me say, as we need to, and swap out pieces as we need to, but keeping those concerns like really small, really granular, and sort of making sure that we're not lumping too much functionality into a single action to represent multiple behaviors. Is that right?
That's 100% it. I totally forgot that you were like the functional person. So yeah.
we're all trying to be functional people, I guess, in the sense of after a pandemic or 2 years of like
I've been described as highly functional.
I feel like I'm barely back to being a functional person, but But yes, big fan of the kind of like functional attitude we have then when thinking about the entire architecture of the app, let alone the code that I am writing within the app, as it were. Cool. Yeah. Okay, so just taking a look at questions we have in Slack. So we had another question, slightly departure, but around caching options for Hasura Community Edition. And I think folks can read a lot about our caching and like kind of other performance considerations on the Hasura docs. Is that right?
Yeah, I just wanted to see if I could find the one. So I'm gonna pull this over to the tab here real quick and do a bit of live Googling, which is highly engaging content.
This is the work.
February community call.
In the February community call,
the February community call, we had a presenter that had for CE a caching solution in place.
Okay, great. So, and that's folks can find all the community calls on our YouTube page. So if you're watching this on YouTube, good news, you're already there. You can check out the past editions of the community call and keep up to date for future editions. Happens every month, right there on YouTube. So we can try to drop that link in a moment.
Awesome. Delta Gateway. That's actually a subscriptions one. He had another piece there as well. I think that was on a caching solution too. So
Cool.
I think
Okay.
it's the Delta Gateway from community member Ace, Ace Sedai. But have a look maybe that direction. But there are people who are solving for caching, and there's other solutions out there as well. But it'll be interesting. Somebody calling out they seen your talk about functional programming, so
Nice, awesome.
we
Thanks
got
for
fans in the
watching. Hope
audience.
you enjoyed it. Yeah, no, love the what I love about functional programming is that it makes it so much easier to do this kind of Lego approach, right? Of like thinking about one behavior at a time, one thing I want to do at a time, and then pulling it all together. So that's what's really nice about Hasura as kind of that abstraction layer for complex architectures like this, is that Hasura can pull it all together for me. I just need to think about the individual pieces that I need, right?
Yeah, and
Awesome.
and exactly to that point, you can take the like login behavior that is inside of the super app reference and plug it into nearly any model where you have a table that actually matches to the data structure, like if you have a user table. So you can basically be able to reuse a lot of this content and be able to reuse these services in a lot of places once you've solved it once.
Awesome.
Let's
Love that. Love doing less work.
yeah. Let's go ahead and then try to follow or do that whole thread follow now of one of the actions, where it was defined inside of Hasura, how that got persisted to metadata, and then we'll have a look at kind of like how these pieces come together, which will probably take us up to the time, I guess, for the hour, and then we'll be able to actually look at that login behavior in depth next week.
Cool. Yeah, right. So next week we have a like sort of more deep dive on the auth and login side, right? And then we have 4 shows total this month, right? We're doing this. We're here every week in April. It's action-packed April. It's pretty exciting. So folks can check out the upcoming topics. We're going to be talking about like payment providers, REST connectors, kind of unifying everything in a single GraphQL API, so folks can find all of the upcoming shows of the Data and IPA show, or DAPI, as we call it.
Data and IPO show, that's going to be later on. It's not
IPO show.
It's not quite yet.
API show.
No, there's no rumors. I don't want to start any rumors.
No. Okay. That's just me being tired. But anyway, hasura.io/community/data and API show has all of the fun stuff we're going to be getting up to. So nice new page. Thanks so much to the team for putting that together.
Yeah.
Awesome possum.
Yeah. So let's have a look here. So what you have essentially is you got your data models: address, order product, order status, product. I'm not going to read all the tables. So anyways, what we have specifically here now is we have a user table. These are not real users. Don't worry. And so essentially we've got this behavior of the name, we've got the email, we've got the password, which apparently we're storing in plain text, again, as we say, not as we do. And then we have the refresh token, which currently is not being used. Addresses that we can see the relationships to the address tables where those are relevant, but like we're not going to worry about that at the moment. So the user table, we want to be able to create a login behavior that would allow somebody to be able, actually, let's go with the sign up behavior. So we'll do the sign up behavior, which is a bit more straightforward to have a look at because that kind of connects a lot of pieces together. So we have the sign up functionality. We want to say we're going to persist that as a behavior inside of our API. So we go to actions. And we have this sign up. Now we have 2 different functionalities here, which we can actually probably abstract away because at the moment this works for CE. If we wanted to use multiple JWTs, we could probably get away with some of this duplication of content. We've had some features that probably could lean this up in the meantime. But for now, we have two different functionalities of abilities, which is why we have 2 different logins, because they're different tables with fully different permission scopes, and it was leaner to architect it that way.
So we're talking about the distinction between the admin
admins versus users, and the you could potentially collapse that. Yeah, there's ways to collapse that model, but for now we're keeping them different for easier mental abstraction.
Sure. Well, and I guess this would depend on kind of the domain or like whatever the problem is that we're trying to solve. The hardest part, right, is coming up with the correct data model to represent
That
what you
is
need to be tracking.
That is 100%, 150% true. So we hear this over and over and over again, is that people discover Hasura, then they go back to the whiteboard, and then they rethink their problem now that they know what they can do with Hasura.
Mm-hmm.
And they take, maybe a week or two on the Hasura side, and then they implement it in a couple of days. And I'm not joking with that. Like it's really the better the tools are, the more you need to think about it, because you're like, okay, like how do I make sure I'm really taking advantage of this functionality? And so that's something where the thought process ahead of time, sketching it out, getting your data model nailed down, you will always be happy with yourself if you do that.
Yeah,
and
no, it's also
then
it's like,
bring that data here. Yeah.
because otherwise, if I just jump in and start writing code, which I know as a developer, like is often the temptation, right? It's just like get your hands on it. I might end up sort of painting myself into a corner, right? Whereas if I take some time to sort of think it through and sketch out, like whether it be physically on a board or piece of paper, or just in kind of my own mind, sketch out the different tables that I'm going to need, the different kind of interactions between different parts of the system and the different behaviors. So these kind of capabilities that I want folks to be able to perform, then I'll be able to kind of implement all of that much more smoothly without painting myself into corners because I jumped the gun, put the cart before the horse, insert other idioms here, etc. Is that right?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
So anyways, we have the sign up, and we decide we want to call this mutation as a convention. You could call this a query. That would be weird. So call it a mutation if you're doing a behavior where you're updating and inserting content inside of your database. As a persisted action, you actually are not restricted with one or the other. You could do it in a couple of ways, but we specifically would recommend you do this via mutation when you're talking about behaviors that will be mutating your content in your database.
Makes sense.
You then define the type. So this is the root type. So on the root type, you're going to go ahead and add a top level field called signup. So again, totally whatever you want to call it. Could be store signup, whatever you want to call that. Followed by then the input type that you want to be able to work with. So in this case, we are giving it a field called params. Again, whatever you want to call it. And then you need to have the actual sign up input, which is what you define down here inside of the actual type definitions. So you say that the sign up input takes in a name, an email, and a password. So that's what I'm giving into the input parameters, params for sign up. And then it's returning a type of JWT. The JWT is being name, email, the token, and a refresh token.
Okay, so all of this structure is essentially up to me to define based on what information, what data is going to be relevant to the given action, the given behavior that I want to do. So that's really like the thing I need to think about in terms of how I'm going to define the way that this block plugs in to the rest of the structure. If that
exactly.
Is that the right way to think about it? Okay.
And in GraphQL land, we've annotated them with exclamation marks, which means that when you're running
We're
the
excited.
Input, means they're excited. Passwords.
Strings. Sorry, what does it actually mean?
Everybody gets a password. No, so it basically means that these are required fields, right? So you have to provide name, email, password, and then the JWT, you have to actually request the response of these as well. So you need to get all of these back when you're reading from it. So that being said, we define the actual mutation itself. Then we define the input type and then the output type, and then we tell it where does the actual action happen. So in this case, we've got this environment variable set up And let's go have a quick peek at it. So we go down to our Docker Compose file. We can see down on our GraphQL engine environment variables, we have the Next.js server URL. And it's this whole funky prefixing because the Next.js application is actually inside of a container in the Docker Compose. Those are implementation details. Don't get distracted by that. So Next.js server URL, which then we are reading that and we're saying, okay, and then that behavior will be passed. So these inputs will be passed to /API /actions /signup. That is the behavior that is now being forwarded to our Next.js application underneath this API, underneath actions, underneath signup. And if we go ahead and open up the signup document page here, we can see exactly what happens with our route handler. This is TypeScript, so if it's not your cup of tea, I apologize, but this is the actual handler for this post request. And what happens is we say, okay, we're going to read off the input. So request.body.input.params. So again, params was that name that we gave the input. This is something you call whatever you want, but we called ours params. And we're just pulling off that email, password, and name that we provided from the API input. And then we're going to go ahead and actually run a GraphQL mutation. And I forgot we have another bit of abstraction here. Oh boy, how much time do we have left? So I will explain why this doesn't look like GraphQL. So basically, we're saying we're running a mutation back to Hasura where we say insert a user with name, email, password. And we're going to go ahead and tell it to, I guess we are hashing the password. Okay, very good.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're getting the refresh token is a randomly generated UUID in this case. And the input parameters, these are the fields that are responded. Okay, I need to do a sidestep on this to explain why this doesn't look like GraphQL. This is using a library called GraphQL Zeus, which generates an SDK from your GraphQL schema. So Hasura generates GraphQL API. That Hasura API is then has a schema backing it. GraphQL Zeus reads that schema and gives you an SDK. In this case, client.mutation is a method on that SDK that then you're passing in names that match to what your API is expecting. So input user 1 is an actual field, is a mutation with object as an input parameter, and then these being the return fields that you're asking for. It's a pretty cool lib. The documentation is atrocious, but it's a really cool lib that works really well. Some people don't like the idea of adding a new thing to learn on top of GraphQL. I can go either way. I think there's some cool stuff like doing Boolean values for what do you get back from responses here, but we're not going down that road for right now.
This is GraphQL editor / GraphQL Zeus. Is that it?
It's GraphQL editor is the company that puts it out. GraphQL Zeus. It's a pretty cool lib, so check it out if that's your cup of tea. It's cool.
Cool. But, so that's something to possibly explore. But if folks were not using, we're trying to, limit the number of dependencies and things here.
Any fetch request here, any API request with whatever GraphQL way that you like to write GraphQL and call GraphQL requests, here you insert a user back inside of Hasura. So from the action, we're now inserting a user back into Hasura. And then we're getting the response from that mutation. So we're getting back inside of the action still. We're getting the response back from Hasura. And then we are generating a JWT that we then will actually, from the data. So we've confirmed we've inserted the user. We're getting back a confirmed user inside of our database. We're now generating a JWT token using this kind of JWT functions here. Adding a cookie to the header, and then we're responding with the token, name, email, and refresh token, which maps exactly to what we expect and then the token 2 is on there. it maps exactly to what our JWT response is expecting.
Mm-hmm.
So we gave it the inputs, and then these are the outputs, and these are the outputs that we're returning back from that handler, where we're able to then say, okay, this is what we expected to get, and now we're sending back the actual data.
Awesome. So
And
this
that is
makes it,
actually, yeah, Red.
No, so this makes it probably really easy to test too, right? Because then I know exactly what type of inputs I'm going to be getting. I know exactly what type of outputs I'm expecting. So as long as I make sure that I'm getting the right outputs for a given input, I can create some nice little test cases and know that my handler is behaving as I expect it to and trust it more than the average computer. No, just kidding.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is the real like power, and that's it. An end of story, right? So
We're done.
I've
Bye, folks.
defined the type. Yeah, I've defined the type. I now have it exposed on the I have it exposed on my API. I can go ahead and say something like sign up, and then it's asking me for all of the stuff that the GraphQL is asking for, password and username, all that kind of stuff, and then I get back the JWT as a response. I've just defined the types under actions, and then I just tell the actual handler here what to do. So
Awesome.
you're supposed to take in these, and you're supposed to put out those. And then
Cool.
anything else that happens in between is where I differentiate my business. That's where I am able to add value. That's where I'm able to actually focus on my time. And that's kind of the story about architecting with Hasura, specifically where I say, all the CRUD stuff I don't have to write API endpoints for. Hasura can do that. Like, they know how to add into the table or select multiple from a table or update or upsert or whatever. Like, that's all stuff that you will write hundreds of handlers for by hand, or just let a tool do it all for you. And then you say, but where you don't know what I want to do, you don't know what my auth provider is, or you don't know how I calculate tax, or you don't know that I'm shipping my products via a carrier pigeon, like really heavy, like herky carrier pigeons. Like, you don't know those details about my business. And so that's where we differentiate ourselves, and we can focus our time on these handlers that do the business logic, but then I'm able to orchestrate these services through Hasura.
Awesome. Awesome. And as you said before, like, because I've already set up this action to define the inputs and the outputs for, let's say this login or the sign up process, if I then decide, oh, I'm actually going to use a different auth provider, or I'm actually going to do something else when I sign up users, I can just kind of point that at a different handler without having to really change much about the action, right? And I can still kind of know that the rest of the system is going to be behaving as it doesn't know what's happening inside of that action handler.
Exactly.
So nice way to swap things out, as you said before. Love it.
Lean backend. Yeah.
That
takes us to time. And I have to say, Anjana, it was a lot of fun having you on the call.
It's so much fun being on the call, and it is so much fun joining all of you. Thanks so much, everybody in chat, for hanging out with us. We had a couple other maybe last minute comments or questions. So we had one nice comment that, Hasura is sort of coming up with this as part of this movement towards less code is better. I like to think that, the best code is the code that you didn't have to write, because that's where the bugs come in, right? So love that. And then we had a question around views in the Hasura console. So it would be great to see an option to create views in the Hasura console. I believe there is a way to put in views on your databases. Is that right? And sort of save those as almost virtual queries.
Well, it's a view, like it's a database view. But it's there is. It's the SQL editor.
So, great. So
so it's not like make a nice query and save it as a view. Like, it's not a console thing. It is an SQL thing. But it's a feature that would be interesting if it's something that you have a really compelling use case for. I would highly recommend making an issue for it. It's something that we're always open to, because we want to go where the users are. Like, that's what we do. So make a request for that, and
indeed,
and happy to persist that. Yeah.
So,
any other questions?
Folks can make other, bug reports, feature requests, etc., on the GraphQL engine repo, right? That's sort of the main place to be letting us know your feedback, issues, pull requests, comments on issues are always helpful, upvotes, etc. So please join the conversation.
And if it's not if it's not like a question or whatever, if you actually have something to offer, or if you're actually wanting to maybe just a quick question, you can even just join Discord, which is where we have our community, where we're constantly roving around there looking for what people have to say, if we're looking for things to help. Yeah, it'd be a good place to get more information as well.
Awesome. So we'll try and grab the link to that as well. But I think you can always find it on hasura.io/community. Let me try to grab this here.
We'll race it. You got it?
Racing? Who's going to win?
Not even a contest.
Alrighty. Well, thank you so much.
That takes us a time.
This has been a whirlwind tour. So yeah, we're a little over time, but we have 3 more streams this month to continue talking about actions and get more into the nitty-gritty on authentication, on connecting to external APIs with REST connectors, on kind of unifying all of this through a single API, GraphQL API. Are there other stuff we're going to dig into?
That's going to be, we're getting into refactor territory there from the Super App. So, because that wasn't even a thing when we wrote this. So that'll be pretty exciting to see that come together too.
Love it. Okay. So
all right, everybody.
Tune into the others, check out the reference app. And thank you so much for having me, Jesse.
Yeah, thanks for being here. We're going to go ahead and wrap it from there. So thanks again, everybody. We will see you next time on Tuesday, same time. Have a great rest of your day, and we will love seeing you around the community. Have a good one, everybody.